For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT now for about 15 years, and it started with my own LSAT journey back when I was preparing to go to law school. I started off in the low 150s, around a 152. I ended up with a 175, and it took me an entire year to get there. And my goal for you is that the insights I gained along the way will allow you to make your score increases with much less pain and heartbreak and struggle, and so that it can be a bit smoother for you and you can move on with your life. Unlike myself, or I'm still doing this 15 years later. Anyway, so I thought that I would have a little fun today, given the recent news about the LSAT logic games section potentially being removed from the exam. Did any of you see that news in the headlines in the past couple of days? There's a chat function in the sidebar. And if you could just let me know if you saw that news about the LSAT potentially being changed sometime in the next 4 years. That was the source of the highlighted section I put up on the whiteboard for you just before starting. So I see a lot of yeses, mostly yeses, one no. But yeah, a lot of you are pretty plugged in. So I'm impressed that you're following the news so closely. So yeah, so I'll share more about that in just a moment. It won't affect anyone applying this cycle. If any changes to the LSAT do go into effect, LSAC will announce them far in advance and give samples of what the new LSAT test form would look like going forward. But anyway, I thought it would be a fun exercise for us to look at the language in LSAC's press release and other public statements about this potential change, to analyze that text LSAT logical reasoning style to see if the wording in the text matches the mainstream media headlines around this story. I have been in touch with the plaintiff's attorney in this case, and I'll share just a bit of background first. Basically, LSAC has been the subject of a number of lawsuits in the past several years for not making the LSAT accessible enough to those with disabilities. In particular, blind and visually impaired law school applicants contend they have been at a disadvantage in the law school admission process because, let's face it, how could you possibly solve LSAT logic games if you could not make a diagram? And if you're not able to see, wouldn't it be incredibly difficult to diagram? LSAC, in its publications like the Super Prep book and the fact that they give you scratch paper on the digital LSAT, suggests that even they admit the utility of being able to diagram. One law school applicant in particular, named Angelo Bino, contended that he was at a disadvantage because he was blind, and that the accommodations LSAC was willing to make were not sufficient to put him on an equal playing field with other law school applicants. So 8 years ago, he sued LSAC, and it went through a number of different courts and was appealed and such, and eventually LSAC reached a settlement with this prospective law school applicant, and they released a joint press statement recently, earlier this week, and I will share it with you here. So this is the statement on the amicable resolution of the Bino versus LSAC lawsuit, LSAC being the Law School Admission Council. I'm not going to read the entire thing here. I want to instead call your attention to the key highlighted paragraph that I wanted to show you, which is right here. And I'll put the link to this press release in the chat as well, in case you would like to take a further look at the entire thing later, for those of you who were not aware of this news story. So basically, the key takeaway is that LSAC has apparently agreed to make some degree of changes to the law school admission process for Mr. Bino and Ms. Taylor, the other prospective applicant in this case. Consistent with the parties' agreement, being LSAC and the applicants, LSAC will complete the work of research and development within the next 4 years, which will enable all prospective law school applicants, all prospective law school students, to take an exam administered by LSAC that does not have the current analytical reasoning section, but continues to assess those abilities. I'm making that text a little bit larger in case it's tough to see it on whatever device you're on. So basically, LSAC will complete this work being research and development into alternative ways to assess analytical reasoning skills And that work will enable all prospective law school students to take an exam administered by LSAC without the current games section, analytical reasoning being games, but continues to test those skills in some other way. Now, let's look at the mainstream media headlines and articles around this story. Click on Detroit, which did an interview with the lead attorney in this case, says LSAT to drastically change. The LSAT that students take today will look substantially different. What else? They said something about the drawing portion. They are removing the drawing portion for all students, not just those with disabilities. Now, is that what the joint press statement says? Are they removing the drawing portion, aka games, for all students? If we go back to the press statement language, it says, within the next 4 years, LSAC will complete the work of research and development, and that work will enable all prospective law students. Is enabling the same as requiring, and is completing the work of research and development within the next 4 years the same as changing the exam within the next 4 years? To me, there is a potential difference there. Now, I've spoken with the plaintiff's attorney. I actually was potentially going to be called as a witness in this case to testify on the fact that logic games essentially require diagramming, or that one is at a severe disadvantage if they cannot reasonably diagram. So I know the attorney, he's a good guy. I think he's acting in good faith here, but his statements to the press, to me, do not seem to be in line with the wording of this press statement. Let's look at another article here. On CNN, obviously a very mainstream publication, saying, now it's changing for everyone. And they interviewed the prospective law student, Mr. Bino. They interviewed the plaintiff's attorney as well, and whose name is Jason Turkish. And he's under the impression that the test will change for everyone. Now, he was quite understandably upset when LSAC released this statement to the public just a couple of days ago in response to the mainstream media articles. They say, and I won't read the entire thing, should there be any significant changes to format, research and development, followed by several stages of pilot testing, would be required. So it's too early to speculate on how the test will evolve as a result of ongoing research. So LSAC is making a much more moderate statement here than the mainstream media articles would lead you to believe. They're not even committing to making any changes at all. They're just saying, should there be any significant changes to format? So they're saying it's possible that all they will do is research and development. Now, if we go back to the press statement, it does suggest that LSAC will enable all law students to take an exam from LSAC without the game section. But again, will they be requiring all applicants 4 years from now to take the LSAT without games? Or will they say, you have a couple of options. If you're blind, you can take the non-games version. If you're not blind, you're taking the regular version we've come to know and love. It's hard to say. Enabling does not mean that everyone will be guaranteed to do this. If I give you a car, I am enabling you to drive around, but you might still need gas. Enabling you to drive is not as simple as giving you a car and you're all set to go. There may be other qualifiers there. It's a little bit more open-ended than the attorney believes. Now, this attorney, he doesn't seem too happy because the drama continues. He released an open letter to LSAC, basically really annoyed with them for their statement that I just showed you, saying that LSAC's release is a departure from the jointly negotiated text. It appears to walk back what was announced in the joint release. And this attorney is calling on LSAC to have a joint press appearance where they will clarify their shared understanding of what exactly they both agreed to in their settlement. So lots of drama here, very open-ended. It's still too early to tell exactly what's going to happen 4 years from now. Will there be games on the exam? Will there not be games? We don't really know. I hope that at least the plaintiffs in this case will get to take an exam that is fair for them. But I really just wanted to show you all of these articles, all of these statements, to show you just how important language is, and just how relevant what you do on the LSAT and in LSAT logical reasoning is, how relevant that is to the practice of law itself. I think it's entirely possible here that the plaintiff's attorney, Jason Turkish, agreed to something in the settlement that he thought had a different meaning from what was actually written in the text itself. The plaintiff's attorney has said to me repeatedly, when they say all here, all prospective law school applicants, all means all applicants will take an exam without games. Games will be a thing of the past. LSAC, however, is saying, should there be any future changes, we will let you know. And it's entirely possible that all LSAC will do is research and development, and they can make one little tweak to the exam, perhaps without removing games entirely. So I don't want to belabor this point too much. I know that this is not really what you came here for, but given the recent news here, I thought it was timely to show you exactly what's going on here. So I've got a couple of questions in the chat here that I want to address. I've got one student named Ella saying, doesn't enabling all prospective law school students to take an alternate exam preclude the possibility of forcing able-bodied applicants to take the old version? Isn't all important here? Yeah, I do think the word all is important here. And it's possible that I think the most reasonable interpretation would be that LSAC simply allows blind test takers to take the non-games version and allow everyone else to take the regular version. It seems strange to me that two applicants would force a wholesale change on the LSAT altogether. But if we really want to get nitpicky here with language, imagine this. Imagine if we go to the language and say, enable all students to take an exam. What if they did a one-off, one-time exam just for accommodated test takers and saying, on this day, you can take the non-games exam as a one-time thing, but going forward, it's going to be games. That seems strange to me, but it is yet another possible interpretation. This is extremely vague. In my opinion, it's quite poorly worded as well. I hope, for the sake of everyone involved, that the actual settlement text is a bit more stringent than what is written here, because to me here, LSAC could take this in a variety of different directions. I think it's pretty open-ended. And so I think that the parties involved need to have a conversation. LSAC, as is characteristic of them, has not been too forthcoming with what they plan to do. And honestly, the plaintiff's attorney can say whatever he wants. Ultimately, it would be on him to sue LSAC if they did not comply with what the parties had agreed to in their joint statement or in the settlement itself. So we will see what happens. Anyway, any other follow-ups here on this particular topic? Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to other things that are, of course, more pressing for those of you applying to law school in the very near future. So a lot of things we could talk about today. I think the biggest and most pressing, of course, is the digital LSAT itself, which, of course, is the biggest actual change we know for a fact is happening right now. So basically, I want to take your attention to LSAC's website. This is familiar.lsac.org, where LSAC has published 3 exams in the digital LSAT format, 71, 73, and 74, which are all very recent from this decade. And they are accurate representations of the exam that you will be taking, whether in the next couple weeks, next month, next several months, what have you. If you go on their site, you can play around with all the various features for games, reasoning, and reading comprehension. There are also some tutorials as well, little video walkthroughs on different features of the exam. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of this right now because I've done it several times in the past already. If you go on my YouTube channel or in my courses, you'll see detailed walkthroughs of the digital LSAT, various features and functions. In particular, there's highlighting tools, there's underlining tools, there's increasing and decreasing the text size, various things you can play around with. The biggest recommendation I would have for you is that you actually use a tablet to play around with this. Don't just do it on your computer, and definitely don't do it on a smartphone. It is not smartphone friendly. A tablet is the best way to see exactly what this would look like. So if you don't have a tablet, I highly recommend borrowing one or buying one and then returning one. The Amazon Fire HD10 is only $150. And again, they have a good return policy. You can always return it afterwards if you decide that it's not for you. But That is the only way to really get the touch screen interactivity. Now, LSAC will be using specifically a Microsoft Surface Go 10-inch, but any old tablet will be fine. A Samsung, an iPad, the Amazon Fire, they're all good. LSAC will also give you a stylus, but it's a little bit unresponsive, so you're better off relying upon your finger if you need to. Now, the biggest thing I think you should be aware with the tablet, though, is that the tablets, they have a lot of glare, meaning that if you walk into your test center and there is harsh fluorescent lighting coming down from the ceiling, it may create glare on your screen, preventing you from properly seeing the questions that you're dealing with. So you may want to first, when you walk in, see, is there glare? Can you tilt the tablet screen to mitigate the glare or remove the glare? If so, great. If there still is a lot of glare, then you want to immediately ask the proctor to move you to a different seat and, of course, point out the issue to them. They will most likely oblige and move you somewhere else, but you're best off doing that before the exam actually starts, because once the timer starts, you're potentially losing time. Is that fair? No, of course not, but it is what it is. And speaking of glitches, there have been a number of glitches with the digital LSAT rollout in July and in September, fewer in September than in July, and hopefully fewer on the upcoming October exam than on the September exam. And I think that with each subsequent exam, things will get better and better. But some potential glitches were that LSAC did not have enough tablets for everybody and had to cancel a test. There were some Wi-Fi connectivity issues with the tablets, or the batteries were too low. And the best LSAC can really do for you in this case is move you to give you a free retake. That's really all they can do. Not ideal, but it is what it is. I've got one question, Stephen, asking me, am I aware of any other digital LSAT practice tests besides the 3 on LSAC's site? No, unfortunately, there are not. LSAC has said repeatedly that they will be adding more to that site, but so far, there are only these 3. I have seen on some of their social media postings representations of exam 68, but those are only press photos. They have not actually put 68 publicly on the digital LSAT interface, but my understanding is that they will be releasing several more exams in the digital LSAT format in the near future. If you're simply looking for more freely available LSATs on LSAC, from LSAC, the Khan Academy has 11 exams, 1 diagnostic and 10 other full-length exams on their website, but those are not in precisely the digital LSAT format with the unique features and interactivity that the digital LSAT itself offers. But if you just want more free questions, Khan Academy is a good place to go. I've got Drew asking, can you still take the paper LSAT? No, pretty much the answer is no. In North America, the LSAT is now fully digital with some rare exceptions for accommodated test takers. But in the US and Canada, it's entirely digital with those rare exceptions. If you really want paper, you could go overseas and take it elsewhere in Europe or in Asia or South America or Latin America. Those are options, but I don't think it's necessarily worth it, especially if you have any familiarity at all with a smartphone or a tablet. A lot of younger applicants actually find the digital preferable because they're digital natives. It just comes naturally to play around with it. One other thing I should add is that if you are doing the digital LSAT prep and you're limited by the number of exams you have in the digital LSAT format, one thing you could do is, if you have access to the PDFs, you could load the PDFs onto your tablet or onto your computer, and then simply use your scratch paper to the side and make all your markings there. Like I said, on the digital LSAT, you will get a 12 to 14 page booklet, 8.5 by 11 paper, unlined, on that thin, cheap newsprint we're accustomed to from the paper LSAT. Do all your work there and don't do any writing on the screen, because on the digital LSAT, you cannot draw freehand, on the tablet itself. You can only, highlight or underline with their very limited tools that I actually don't recommend. So the short answer is paper and pencil practice tests are still perfectly useful. And in fact, we kind of need them to be, because there are nearly 100 released LSAT exams, 87 of which are numbered, but only 3 in the precise digital LSAT format. So we need to use those other nearly 100 exams. And honestly, using them on paper or PDF is totally fine. The content of the exam has not changed at all. Only the format in which it is delivered, only with those highlighting and underlining and other tools. And like paper, you can go back and change your answers. And in fact, rather than having to bubble things in slowly into an oval with a number 2 pencil and erase it, you can, with one click or one tap of the stylus or of your finger, you can change your answers. You can very easily eliminate answer choices. You can bubble in with one tap or one click, and you can go back and change things and flag things if you need to. Personally, I'll flag at least 3 or 4 questions within a single section of logical reasoning and come back to them at the end. And with one glance, you can look down at the bottom of the screen and see exactly what you have flagged to return to later. And you can also make any notes you want on the scratch paper as well. That scratch paper, that booklet of 12 to 14 pages, you have that available to you for the entire exam, not just the logic games section. So if you want to make any brief notes about the author's opinion in a reading comprehension passage, any quick little summaries, you can do that. If you want to diagram formal logic reasoning questions, you can do that as well. So lots of great options available to you with the scratch paper. I think it's overall a net win to have the digital LSAT format as it exists. And I think with time, as they work out some of these tech glitches, it will become better and better experience for test takers. And so for those of you who took it in July or September, you probably were aware of at least the reports of the glitches. I think October will be even better than September. And for those taking it in November or next year, I think it will get increasingly better with time. Now, I've gotten some questions around prepping for the November LSAT, what a timeline might look like 6 to 7 weeks out, and then what you might do with regard to timing for each section. So this question in particular is in response to my student Kenneth, who was asking about what to be doing in the lead up to the November LSAT test date. So if you've already been studying for several months up to this point, as I imagine many of you have, and you've built that strong foundation, what do you do going forward? Specifically over the next 6 to 7 weeks, what might your study plan look like? I would recommend, if you already have a strong foundation on the basics of the exam, you now work on pacing and endurance, meaning when you can, you do a full-length 5-section exam to work on both your pacing and endurance, perhaps on the weekend, maybe on Friday if you're in college and you don't have Friday classes. And then on the other days of the week, you do individual sections, 35 minutes timed, and then excruciatingly detailed review of those sections and of those full-length exams that you did. And that review looks like the following. Let's say for logical reasoning, for instance, you want to look at, where did your misunderstanding stem from? Was it in the stimulus? Was it in the question stem? Or was it in the choices? If it was in the stimulus, was it about not properly understanding the conclusion versus the evidence, or the subsidiary conclusion, or counter premises or filler, whatever it may be? Or was it in the question stem, misinterpreting the question type, the task they were asking you to solve? Or was it in the answer choices? And if it was in the choices, what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it or consider it, and what ultimately made it wrong? And what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct? You want to do this again and again and again, not just for the questions you got wrong, but for any of those where you were down to 2, you guessed and got lucky, because it could have just as easily gone the other way the next time around. So let's say if you even scored a 170 on your practice test, that's obviously amazing. That puts you in the top 3% of test takers. That's about 10 questions wrong. But there may have been another 10 to 15 questions that you guessed on and got lucky, or you weren't 100% confident in. So that's 20 to 25 questions that you could potentially review. That takes hours. That takes, done right, at least 3 to 4 hours. And that's only spending around maybe 10 minutes or so on a given question, reviewing it. So there's plenty of time to be invested in reviewing. And so people will say, but that means I can't do 3 exams a week, or I can't do 4 exams a week. And the answer is, so don't do 3 to 4 exams a week. Maybe doing 1 to 2 exams a week is enough. And then some other individual sections you do will give you plenty to work on. Then if you want to do non-timed work, you could, if you identify particular trends in questions you're getting wrong, like you determine certain weak areas like strengthening questions or logic games or grouping games in particular, you might do several grouping games by type to drill those. And when you're doing individual games by type or individual logical reasoning by type or anything else by type, that is not timed because it doesn't make sense to time individual games or individual logical reasoning questions. It just does not make sense because they are not meant to be timed individually. One game cannot be constrained to 8 minutes and 45 seconds because they're not all of equal difficulty. Some games can and should take 12, 13 minutes, like the infamous CDs game from Test 31, Game 2, the game featured in Legally Blonde about new and used CDs. That is one of the toughest games of all time, and there is no way you should be doing that in only 9 minutes if it's the first time that you've seen it. So some food for thought there about what your plan should look like. Happy to answer follow-ups on that, though, from Kenneth or anyone else. Now, Ali is asking, best tips for improving timing for each section of the exam. So obviously, I could talk for endlessly about this. I'll try to keep it brief and just give a brief overview of some timing advice for each section. For games, make use of previous diagrams of previous hypothetical scenarios that you have drawn. Too often, students draw diagrams and don't reuse them, but the work you did for question number 3 could help you for question number 5. And your correct answer to the orientation question, the first question of the game, will give you a hypothetical to use as well. One other thing is that you should not necessarily do games questions in the order given. It's possible that doing hypothetical question, the orientation question, then local, and then global questions is more efficient than simply doing them in order because the diagrams that you draw for the local question could help you solve the later global questions. For logical reasoning, the questions are presented in a general order of difficulty, not a perfect order, but a general order, meaning that you should work through the easier questions, the earlier questions, more quickly than the harder questions that come later. So you might want to do the first 10 questions in 10 to 12 minutes, building up a time bank to apply to the tough questions that come later. And like I said earlier, even I personally will flag 3 to 4 questions to come back to later. And so I attack those again with my time bank that I built up. I don't risk getting bogged down on the tough questions in the moment. Rather, I just skip them and come back to them later. And in response to Sammy's question, to Pedro's question about skipping around, it is not that difficult to skip around on the digital LSAT. There are left and right arrows and also a navigation bar at the bottom. So you can easily click back to any question you did earlier or that you flagged earlier to come back to. And so on the digital, I would simply flag those questions that I want to skip and come back to them later. But within the game, I would probably just click left and right to go between the ones within an individual defined section. Now, to circle back on timing, for reading comprehension, again, I would not necessarily do the questions for a passage in the order given. Here, I would do the broad global questions first, like the main idea and primary purpose questions. Then I would do the local detail questions that give you specific reference points to go back to in the passage. And then finally, I would do the more inferential questions that require reading between the lines. I would do those last. And to put some time benchmarks here, I would aim to read the passage itself in about 2.5 to 3 minutes. And then that way I will spend the remaining time on the questions themselves. But if you spend any more than 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage, you will have significantly less than 1 minute per question because there are about 6 or 7 questions per passage. So if you take average 8:45 per passage minus 3 minutes for your initial read, you're already down to 5:45 to answer 6 or 7 questions. So you really don't want to go below that. Anyway, happy to address follow-ups, but that's my quick overview about timing. Now, Sammy's asking, is there anything unique about the November test that you should be aware of? Some people talk about different test dates being different. So for example, when there were only 4 exams per year, people would always speculate that the February exam was strange in some way because the February exam was the only undisclosed administration. The other 3 exams were all released. So the February being unreleased lent it an air of mystery. And so I can understand why people will think, oh, certain months are harder than others, or maybe people who are not as bright take one exam date over another. And so if you want to do better relative to your competitors, take the exam on that particular month. And I can assure you that there is no difference between months. LSAC is too smart for that. They equate the exams. So every exam administered is equal in difficulty they have the raw score conversions to account for that. So let's say if one exam was marginally easier than another, the raw score conversions, aka curve, would adjust accordingly to account for that. So things would cancel out. So no, there is nothing unique in particular about November or about October or about January or any other exam. You are in the same position no matter which exam you take. Now I've got Ella asking about reading comprehension. Will you have to flip back to the passage while also answering the questions? The answer is that you can see at the same time both the passage and the questions. You have to scroll up and down a little bit, but that's pretty much all you have to do. And I would love to show you the digital LSAT more, but LSAT has notified me that they don't want me displaying actual question text on screen due to copyright things. They're currently redoing their licensing policies due to test security issues. And so as much as I would love to show it to you, I'm not able to. But on my YouTube channel, I've done some walkthroughs of the format, but back when LSAT was displaying the features without the actual question text. So if you go on my YouTube channel or in my courses, you'll see some of the details there. Let's see, anyway, any other questions on digital LSAT prep in particular? Let's see, I've got a question about the LSAT writing. So one other change that happened this year is that the writing sample or the writing section went digital as well in June specifically. So in June, the writing section was removed from the paper LSAT, removed from test day itself as well, meaning that when you walk in on test day, you will not be doing the writing sample at the test center. You will not be writing it by hand. Instead, you will be typing it out on your computer later at home or wherever you bring your laptop. And you have up to 1 year to complete the writing sample after your test administration. You are not obligated to do it on the same day or even that week. I recommend not procrastinating on it though, because LSAC will not release your test score to law schools until you have completed the writing section specifically. The writing section is still not scored, but it may weigh a little bit more heavily than it did previously in the law school admission process because it's now typed rather than handwritten, meaning that it is more easy to see what students have written. It's more easy to parse their writing since it's not handwritten anymore. So I might devote a little bit more attention to it than previously, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. The writing sample content has not changed at all. And in fact, since you're able to type, you might be able to complete it more quickly and have more time to review what you've written. And there is spell check on the writing sample. So that's a pretty nice benefit as well. One other thing I should talk about also is the new LSAT retake limit that went into effect this year as well. Previously, or a while back, it was you could take the LSAT only 3 times within a 2-year period. LSAC then changed things so that there was no limit at all on how many times you could take the LSAT, period. You could take it every month if you wanted to. But because LSAC is now administering the exam nearly every month, they have to reuse old test forms more than they previously had to. So anyone taking an undisclosed exam, like many upcoming exams are undisclosed, that means that LSAC may re-administer that same exam sometime in the future. Maybe 2 years from now, maybe 5 years from now. They might administer it overseas. They might administer it as a Sabbath observer's exam. And if they disclose it, then they can't reuse it because it's public information and students, a wide swath of students may have seen those exam questions. Whereas right now, a very infinitesimal percentage of students may have seen those questions. And obviously that would not be fair, but LSAC doesn't really have anything else they can do because it costs them nearly 1 million exams to create an entirely new test form from scratch. And they are not yet ready to create 9 or 10 new test forms per year. So they have no choice but to reuse old stuff. Is that ideal? Not really, but it is what it is. And these new retake limits are specifically that you can only take the LSAT 3 times in one admissions cycle, cycles running from June to May of the following year. So if you take it in September, October, and November of 2019, then you are done until June of 2020. Alternatively, if you take it in November and January and March, you can still take it again in July and again in September of next year. That would be okay. So you can apply to law school with 5 tests on your record, but they can't all be within the same admission cycle running from June to May. So the limits are, again, 3 times in one cycle, 5 times in a 5-year period, 7 times for life. And once you get a 180, you can't take it again. And that's really more for folks like me, where if all the tutors and instructors out there and professionals out there who do this for a living took it, they might screw up the so-called curve, and LSAC's test equating process would be a little bit skewed there. So they don't want that. And they also want to limit the number of times applicants could potentially re-see, or there's probably a better word for that than re-see, but see again the same test content from one administration to another, which would, of course, taint the validity of the exam. I've got one ever-present myth out there about question related to this myth about law schools averaging scores versus taking the highest from Kaylee. Kaylee's asking, do schools take your highest score, or do they look at all tests you've taken? So the short answer is, they really only care about your highest score, but they do see all scores on your record being all tests you've taken within the past 5 years. So if you took the LSAT back in 2011, that score is no longer on your record. If you got a 120 or a 180, doesn't matter. Law schools will not know about that, and they will not consider it valid. But if you took it 3 years ago and got a 180, you're good. And in fact, with the new limit, you can't take it again. If you got a 173 years ago, you could retake it now and get a 175, and that's great. And if you got a 170 previously, retake it and get a 160, no big deal. The 170 is still what counts. Now, is it better to have a 170 and have that be it, or have, let's say, 2 170s versus a 170 followed by a 160? Of course, it's better to have only the higher score, not a higher followed by a lower. But it is what it is. The reason law schools only have incentive to consider the highest is because that is what gets reported to the American Bar Association. And that is what, in turn, is submitted to U.S. News for the ever important U.S. News Law School rankings, which everybody cares about. And law school admission officers, their jobs are based in some part on how well they do in the rankings. So if they admitted a lot of applicants with low scores and that dragged down the school's median in the rankings, that would be a very bad thing for the school. Schools, their marketing, their alumni donations, and many other things, their reputation rests on them having high numbers. So they really do only have reason to consider the highest. Now, they will talk about holistic review, in part because it sounds nicer, but in reality, this is all they have incentive to care about. I've got Shilpa asking, what books and resources do I recommend to study for the LSAT? Well, first and foremost, I recommend my own. On my website, the LSAT blog, I have a variety of books and courses, including study plans, guides, cheat sheets, explanations, and of course, full video courses for every section. And so that is a great starting point. If you're looking for more, not to be totally self-promotional here, I recommend the Khan Academy is a good starting point if you have a limited budget, or if you just want to dip your toes into the water a little bit. Khan Academy, like I said, they have several free exams. They have some good basic overviews of the material, but it's honestly not enough. So I would recommend, in addition, getting the actual official books of exams published by LSAC. They are available in books of 10 on Amazon. They have titles like 10 actual official LSAT prep tests and 10 more actual official LSAT prep tests, and LSAT prep tests volume 6 and volume 5. Very confusing titles. They're very similar, but contain different exams. And so let me see if I could pull up a list for you actually. So again, on my website, the LSAT blog, I have a listing of all the prep tests with links to them on Amazon. So you have an easy starting point to have them all organized. So I'm linking that there in the chat for you to find a neat organized list of everything from exam 87 all the way back to exam number 1. That is your best starting point. And then if you're looking for things like explanations and study guides and such, I have a list of those too that I will pull up for you here. So here's a list of the books as well. If you're looking for one starting point, I recommend the study plans because they give you day by day exactly what to do and what not to do every single day over the course of your prep. And so for my courses, for example, if you need a study plan, just reach out and let me know and I'll send it to you. I have guidelines showing you basically read these articles, watch these videos, then complete these exact LSAT practice problems from the old exams. And my study plans are oriented around a 5-step approach that I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. LASER. So learning is the theory, doing basically reading chapters in textbooks, learning the basics, an overview of what the exam involves, what are games, what is reasoning, what are ordering games, what are grouping games, and so on. Learning the theory. A is for accuracy, basically doing individual questions by type to learn the basics. So you would do 20 strengthening questions in a row, 20 weakening questions in a row, 30 grouping games in a row to start to see the patterns underlying the exam. Because when you open a book of exams, you're seeing them all scattered around. You have a grab bag of questions without any rhyme or reason to them. So my job is to help unscramble them for you so that you can approach them in a systematic fashion. Then back to LASER. S is for sections, doing individual timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. So this is where you do things like I said, doing the easier logical reasoning questions faster, maybe the first 10 in 10 to 12 minutes, so that you have more time for the tougher questions that come later. Then E is for exams and endurance, doing full-length 5-section exams, because believe me, after 3 hours of LSAT without much of a break, your brain is fried. On test day, you're doing 3 sections back to back, then you have a short 10-minute break, then you're doing 2 more sections back to back. Really grueling. Even my brain's fried after that. And so you want to be doing at least 1 timed exam per week in the final month or 2 before test day. So for those of you taking it in October, I would highly recommend over the next 2 weeks doing at least 1 timed exam per week. And certainly if you're taking it in November, 1 timed exam a week would also be a good strategy for you as well. Then finally, R is for review, which is the process I talked about earlier, analyzing where your mistakes come from, the stimulus, the question stem, the choices, what is tempting about the wrong answer, what is discouraging about the right answer, and actually writing this out, articulating it, either writing it out in a notebook or typing it out or talking it over with a friend or a study buddy or a coach or a tutor. It's really important to get this out of your own head because it's too easy when you're on your own to simply look at the correct answer and say, I get it now, and move on. It is much tougher to articulate or paraphrase what the question says in your own words. So could you, in a reading comp passage, articulate the major viewpoints presented in the passage? For a logical reasoning question, could you paraphrase the argument in your own words and explain it to somebody else? And then talk over why is the wrong answer wrong and why is the right one right? Could you reverse engineer the exam to see it from the test maker's perspective and look at exactly what was tempting in that wrong answer? What trap did LSAC lay? You need to spot those traps because if you make a mistake once, you are guaranteed to make it again unless you learn from your mistakes. Because LSAC, they don't do anything new under the sun. They keep reusing old stuff. I actually have an article where I listed 7 LSAT logic games that repeated. And I'm going to pull it up for you here because it's really telling to see just how similar these games are to each other. The patterns are apparent to me in games and in logical reasoning. They're a bit more subtle in reading comp, but even in logical reasoning, there are methods of reasoning that repeat and tempting wrong answers that repeat. So for example, a lot of times in logical reasoning, for a necessary assumption question, they will put a very tempting sufficient assumption choice prior to the correct answer because people love picking strong language. So they will actually pick the sufficient assumption before and move on confidently wrong before they even see the correct answer, which is in fact a necessary assumption. So review is really one of the most important things to be doing, but is often overlooked. I've got someone asking, is one set of books better than another? Not really. I think any company that specializes in the LSAT is a fairly good option. It's really just a question of you seeing which methods work better for you, which style you like more. Some companies are more entertaining than others. Some are more matter of fact than others. One thing I can say is I would not go for LSAT for Dummies because first off, you want a good score, not a low score. And secondly, you want a company that is using real official LSAT questions, not simulated or fake ones, because those often contain mistakes or are not realistic. There are tons of books on Amazon where the reviews are actually calling out the publisher for putting in mistakes or not properly proofreading. So you want to be very careful about that. I would suggest strongly going with a major company that is renowned for focusing on this exam exclusively. It's too important an exam, too tough an exam to farm out to somebody who's teaching every exam under the sun and reusing their strategies for the SAT, for also the LSAT and the MCAT and GRE. The LSAT is a unique beast, as I'm sure you've discovered by now. Ella is asking about the experimental section. Can you figure it out on test day? Can you guess which one it is? The answer is no. Do not try to figure out what the experimental section was during your exam. The risk is too great. The odds of you being wrong are far too high. LSAC is doing its best to test out new questions for future administrations with the experimental section, but for the average student, it would be very tough to spot. Even for myself, I might not be able to figure it out during the exam, because it's not as if the style of questions is necessarily different. What is most likely the case is that on the experimental section, the section as a whole may have a difficulty level that is easier or harder than what LSAC is looking to do. But it's marginal. LSAC is very good at what they do. Their data analysis abilities are huge. So the content will not differ substantially or noticeably, most likely, from what you've seen elsewhere. Only the difficulty overall as a section may differ. And maybe some questions will perform slightly off from what LSAC is looking for, but you won't be able to figure it out. Of course, after the exam is completed, if you had 2 sections of games or 3 sections of reasoning, you will know at least that one of those was experimental and unscored, but you won't know which one unless you talk it over with others after the exam and say, did you have a game on flowers? And the other person says no, then you know that your game with flowers was experimental and not scored. But that's really the extent of it. Got another question asking, how often should you give yourself a break while you're studying? Should you take off a day, or like every other day, or once every third day? I definitely recommend taking days off with your LSAT studies. Don't try to do a full-length exam every single day. That is a recipe for burnout. Rather, I would suggest maybe taking off 2 or 3 days per week as you need. So if you're working full-time, maybe one of your work days is a day where you're not going to study for the LSAT and you'll do more of your studying on the weekend. Alternatively, if you're still in school, then maybe you will do some of your studying on a Friday when you don't have class. So in my study plans, I do build in off days because I don't want you to burn out. And I'm also aware of the fact that life happens. You know, you have work or college classes, or you have a family obligation, or you have a vacation or a holiday, or you get sick. Things come up. And so I built in buffers there so that you won't feel like you're falling behind constantly, because we all have things that we have going on in our lives. But I don't want you to take too many days off and lose steam with your prep. So never let an entire week go by without studying if your timeline's on the span of 2 to 3 months. If you're taking the LSAT in June of next year, though, then you might want to take a more slow and steady wins the race approach, where you gradually study here and there and build up as you go. But definitely off days are crucial. Let's see about retake prep. So if you've taken the exam before and you're looking to retake, a common concern I hear a lot is about reusing old material. Let's say you've burned through a lot of recent exams and you don't know what to use now. So let's say if you took it in September and you did everything in the 80s, what do you do for October or November? Well, first off, you know, this exams in the 70s would still be good to use. Alternatively, you could still use the exams in the 80s, because let's say you did exam number 85, you took it full length, you reviewed it, and you feel like you can't use it again. Would you get a perfect 180 if you took exam 85 again with a fresh copy? The answer is probably no. And so if the answer is no, why is the answer no? Why could you not get a perfect 180 if you've seen all the questions before, you've reviewed it in depth, and you've seen all the correct answers? It's because the LSAT is really hard and you don't have a perfect memory, and you're actually prone to making the same mistakes that you've made before. which means that you did not review enough. And that's okay. You can just review more. You can review those questions again. But the fact that you can review again and that you would not get everything right looking at it a second time means there is still value to be extracted from those exam questions, which means not a big deal. And if it's your first time, but you are aware that you might need to retake in the future, that means save some new exams. So you might want to do every even numbered exam in the lead up to your test date, then save all the odd numbered exams for a potential future retake. Kirsten's asking, she's planning to write the exam in mid-February. Is this enough time to prepare? The answer is yes. We are in October right now. You've got about 4 months, about 16 or 17 weeks, I think, until February. That is plenty of time. I typically recommend allowing 3 to 5 months to achieve your fullest potential on the exam if you're starting from scratch. Ideally, closer to 5 to 6 months, 3 at a minimum. So if you started today, if today is day 0, that means that you are allowing just about an average amount of time that I would recommend. And if you want to retake, great. I'd say maybe retake in March, retake in June. And it's nice to study early, in fact. If you're for those of you applying this cycle, you're fine. If you take it October or November and apply with the November LSAT, that is totally fine. That is not too late. Even taking it in January and applying this cycle to start law school in fall 2020 is not too late. If you take in the spring, it's starting to get a little bit late. But if you are taking it in February of 2020 and you want to apply in fall 2020 to start law school in fall 2021, that is wonderful because you're way ahead. That means that you could take it in February, potentially retake in June or July, then potentially retake again in September if you need to, and then apply in the fall. Obviously, we don't want to assume you're going to take it 3 times right out of the gate, but it's good to have peace of mind, to have the knowledge that you could retake it if you needed to, and that would not delay your applications significantly, if at all. Like I said, law schools do not average multiple scores. They only take the highest score, meaning there is really no downside to retaking, assuming that you are aware of those retake limits I mentioned earlier. Meaning that, let's say your aptitude was a 165. That's where you deserved to score. Maybe you walk in and you get a 165 on, let's say, the October LSAT. That's great. You could then retake in November, and through luck alone, you could score 3 points higher and get a 168. There's actually a margin of error or a score band of 3.5 points on either end, meaning if you deserve a 165, you might get a 165 or a 168 or a 162. Maybe even 1 point higher or lower than that as well. But if you score lower, no big deal. They only take the highest. If you score higher, that's great because they take the highest. So applying with a 168 will open far more doors than a 165 will. And because the LSAT's offered nearly every month now, that means that if you're taking October and that's your target, you could retake in November and only stay fresh on the LSAT for another 4 weeks, maybe doing simply 1 timed exam per week plus review of that exam. Maybe your understanding improves not at all and you do 3 points better. Or if you study and actually improve your understanding a little bit, you might do even better than that 168. So in my opinion, there's no reason to apply to law school with only 1 LSAT score. In my opinion, it's always worth retaking at least to have a second or third take because of that luck factor and because a little more time means maybe a little more understanding and a couple points more. Even 1 point on the LSAT could be worth thousands of dollars in terms of more scholarship money or getting into a better law school. And so in my mind, a higher LSAT score and the time invested in prepping for it is the best ROI you'll ever get. Biggest return on investment is just a couple points more on the LSAT in terms of the doors it could open or the scholarship money you could get. Because it could get, $10,000 a year over the course of 3 years. That's tons, especially if that reduces your debt or allows you more career options upon graduating because you're not forced to take that corporate job when your spouse or significant other says, all that law school debt's really eating us up. Maybe time to bite the bullet on that one and take something you don't really want to do. So to me, optionality is huge there. So Ali's asking, for what scores would you potentially get scholarships for top 20 law schools? it really comes down to their medians. So if you go on, let's say LSAC's website, there's a calculator I'm going to pull up for you here, where you could basically input different GPAs and LSAT scores. And LSAC will calculate for you where you would stand relative to other applicants. So I put that link in the chat there with their calculator. Basically, you could see any given law school's 25th percentile and 75th percentile of their matriculating applicants. And so you want to see where you stand. If you are below their medians, it means that they are a reach school and your odds of getting in are relatively low. If you are above their median, meaning that your LSAT and GPA are above their median accepted applicant, then you have a relatively higher chance of getting in, and law schools might be willing to give you scholarship money to entice you to choose their school over others, because you choosing their school will raise their status in the rankings, which they very much want to do. And so the specifics vary depending on the school and the idiosyncrasies of the cycle and what else is going on for them that year. But it stands to reason that if you are above their average or median really, then they will have reason to give you scholarship money to entice you. And so in some cases, you might want to choose the higher ranked school with less scholarship money, or in other cases, depending on your financial situation and what your goals are, you might choose a lower ranked school with more scholarship money. And also consider that rankings are not the only factor. For example, in New York City, where I'm based, Fordham Law School has a greater reputation than its national ranking would suggest, because there are many Fordham Law grads in New York City. And so if I'm applying for a job as a Fordham Law grad, everyone knows Fordham Law here, and they know it has a good reputation. They know other Fordham Law grads. And so my career prospects as a Fordham Law grad might be better here in New York City than in California or in Texas. So things vary depending on geography as well. Just another consideration there. Same goes for UCLA, by the way, just to cover the West Coast as well. UCLA is a great ranked school, but it has an even better reputation in California than it does on the East Coast. So just to consider that. Kenneth is asking about transferring law schools. Would it be worthwhile to, let's say, choose a lower ranked school initially, or go to a lower ranked school initially, and then transfer into a top 14 law school? Transferring is tough, and there's a certain inertia factor as well. Once you are well situated at a particular law school in a particular city, you might have a significant other there, you might be feeling good about where you're at, you might like that school, and you might be unlikely to transfer at a later date. And so, of course, transferring is always a possibility. I think it's not as great a possibility as people might think, and there's a luck factor there. You can't count on it. But so it's a possibility, but I wouldn't guarantee it. I think obviously the best course of action is get into the top 14 right out of the gate initially, but easier said than done. So I certainly understand where the question is coming from, but consider it as a possibility, but I wouldn't count upon it. Anyway, we've been going here for about an hour, and so if there are no other burning questions here, I'm going to leave off for now. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.